Welcome to our discussion of Larry Laudan's A Confutation of Convergent Realism. In part 1 of this video, we'll follow Laudan and begin by explaining convergent epistemic realism and the arguments realists use to support it. In part 2, we'll examine two arguments Laudan uses to show that evidence from the history of science does not support convergent epistemic realism as much as realists have argued. Part 1. What is convergent epistemic realism? Laudan characterizes convergent epistemic realism as follows. First, scientific theories are typically approximately true. Second, terms in a scientific theory genuinely refer. We've already seen that the Dummett-Putnam-Boyd characterization of scientific realism basically uses R1 and R2. Third, successor theories preserve the apparent reference of earlier theories and the relations among them, which means that successor theories contain their predecessors as limiting cases. This is a clearly anti-Kuhnian stance. Fourth, to be acceptable, new theories must explain why prior theories were successful. And finally, perhaps most importantly, R1 through R4 entail the scientific theories should be empirically successful. Overall, convergent epistemic realists believe that the success of science, as we see it throughout history, provides empirical confirmation for the philosophical view we call scientific realism. There are two main arguments used by realists that illustrate why their philosophical view is supposed to be supported by empirical evidence. These arguments are abductive arguments. They are inductive arguments to the best explanation. They are not deductive arguments. The first argument is this. If our scientific theories are approximately true, then they are successful. If the central terms in our scientific theories refer, then they are successful. Our scientific theories are successful, so therefore it's probably the case that our scientific theories are approximately true and their central terms refer. The second argument realists have used is the following. If our scientific theories are approximately true and their central terms refer, then successive scientific theories are commensurable. Scientists strive for and attain commensurability across successive scientific theories, so therefore it's probably the case that our scientific theories are true and their central terms genuinely refer. Overall, the argument that convergent epistemic realists are trying to defend looks like this. If convergent epistemic realism is true, then we expect science to be successful. If it's not the case that the philosophical view called convergent epistemic realism is true, then the success of science is a miracle. Consequently, the success of science confirms convergent epistemic realism. Part 2. Laudan's critique of convergent epistemic realism. For this part 2 of our discussion, I want to focus only on what Laudan has to say about the relationship between whether a scientific theory's central terms refer and whether that theory is successful. Laudan asks us to consider the following claims. First, scientific theories are successful. Second, if central terms in a theory refer, then that theory is successful. Third, if a scientific theory is successful, then its central terms refer. And fourth, central terms in scientific theories refer. Clearly, there are logical relationships among these statements. For example, S1 and S3 entail S4, and S4 and S2 entail S1. However, Laudan argues that S2 is false, and S3 is false. Let's look at how he argues for this. Let's consider S2 first. S2 says that if central terms in a scientific theory refer, then the theory is successful. Since S2 is an if-then statement, to argue that S2 is false, Laudan has to argue that it is true that the central terms of a theory refer, but false that it is successful. Now, because Laudan is trying to argue that the history of science does not support scientific realism, he chooses a historical example, specifically Wegener's theory in geology. Wegener's theory was an attempt to explain a variety of geological features by postulating that parts of the Earth, that we now call plates, moved relative to one another. This theory was a precursor to the theory that we now call plate tectonics. Laudan points out that realists use a very liberal notion of reference. For example, even if much of what Wegener's theory says about plates is false, a realist will still claim that Wegener's theory referred to what the theory of plate tectonics calls plates. Because of this, the realist would say that the central terms in Wegener's theory referred. However, Wegener's theory was wildly unsuccessful. So we have here an example of a theory whose central terms refer, but which is unsuccessful, and hence S2 is false. Let's now consider S3. S3 says that if a scientific theory is successful, then its central terms refer. Again, to argue that this if-then statement is false, Laudan has to find an example of a case where we have a successful scientific theory, the first part of the if-then statement is true, but its central terms do not refer. The second part of the if-then statement is false. Laudan chooses as his example the 19th century ether theory in electromagnetism. According to this theory, the universe was filled everywhere with a very subtle fluid that was the seat of electromagnetic interactions. So, for example, light was construed as a periodic vibration or wave of this medium called the ether. 19th century electromagnetism was a very successful theory, which was able to account for a lot of empirical phenomena. However, with the advent of developments that culminated in Einstein's theory of special relativity in 1905, physicists became convinced that there is no such thing as the ether. Hence, one of the central terms of the theory clearly does not refer. So S3 is false. Overall, Laudan's strategy is rather clever. Realists argue that the best evidence for convergent epistemic realism is empirical, that is, evidence that comes from examining the history of science. However, Laudan argues that if we look at that evidence carefully, it's a wash. That is, there is as much evidence in the history of science to support the philosophical view that convergent epistemic realism is true, as there is to support the view that convergent epistemic realism is not true. Overall, says Laudan, we have to remain skeptical. Laudan's main point, then, is not to argue for anti-realism, but only to emphasize that the empirical argument realists have tried to use to defend convergent epistemic realism is inadequate to the task at hand.